What happens when Hollywood's most composed leading man is pushed past his breaking point, live on national television? The studio lights of The View burned a little brighter that morning, as if sensing that the usual chatter was about to ignite into something unforgettable. The cameras zoomed in on Brad Pitt as he shifted in his chair, a polite but faintly wary smile tugging at his lips. Across the table, Sonny Hostin leaned forward with the sharp focus of someone preparing to ask the question that might crack that calm facade. The tension had been building since the commercial break. The studio audience sensed it. Their usual scattered applause had faded into a restless buzz. Even Joy Behar, often the first to poke a guest for a laugh, seemed unusually restrained. Whoopi Goldberg sat with her chin in her palm, watching Brad with that quiet, unreadable look she sometimes wore before a storm. The interview had started light, talk of Brad's latest film, his charity work, his easy charm winning a few laughs. But Sonny's eyes were locked on him like a hawk circling prey. She cleared her throat softly, adjusted her notes, and then said the words that would flip the tone of the room. "Brad," she began, her voice calm yet edged with steel, "you've been celebrated for decades as one of Hollywood's most admired actors. But some people feel you've been selective about the issues you speak up on, especially when it comes to accountability in this industry. Do you think that's fair?" The question landed with a weight that silenced even the faint coughs and whispers in the audience. Brad blinked once, twice, the polite smile faltering. He glanced briefly at Joy, then at Sonny, and let out a short, careful breath. "I think everyone chooses how they use their voice," he replied evenly. "Sometimes the best way to make a difference isn't in front of the cameras." Sonny tilted her head, her tone sharpening just slightly. "But don't you think silence, especially from someone as influential as you, can sometimes be seen as complicity?" A low murmur rippled through the audience. The camera caught Brad's jaw tightening for a fleeting second before he smoothed his expression. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the table. "I don't think it's fair to say silence is complicity," he said, his voice still controlled but now carrying a deeper note, like a distant rumble of thunder. "There are conversations that happen away from the spotlight, private conversations that matter just as much." Sonny didn't flinch. "But the public doesn't see those private conversations. What they see is you, one of the biggest names in Hollywood, sitting back while others take risks. Isn't it easy to stay quiet when the weight of accountability is carried by others?" The moment stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Whoopi shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes moving between Brad and Sonny. The studio audience was hushed, leaning in, as if collectively holding their breath. Brad chuckled, but it wasn't the warm, disarming laugh fans knew so well. It was short, strained. "That's an interesting way to frame it," he said. "I don't think staying quiet has ever been easy for me. I've just chosen to pick my battles." Sonny's voice dipped lower, steadier. "But don't you think that choice, to pick battles, looks a lot like privilege?" The air itself seemed to thicken. A couple of audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One even whispered an audible, "Wow," that the microphones barely caught. Brad's eyes darkened. For the first time since sitting down, he broke eye contact, glancing briefly toward the floor before meeting Sonny's gaze again. "Privilege," he repeated quietly, as if testing the word on his tongue. "That's a big word to throw around in a 3-minute segment." "Big words for a big issue," Sonny replied, her tone unwavering. Something subtle but undeniable shifted in Brad's posture. The famously laid-back movie star now sat straighter, his expression carved into something harder. There was a flicker of emotion in his eyes, defensiveness, maybe, or anger held on a tight leash. "You know," he said slowly, "I came here to talk about the film, about some projects I care about. Not to be lectured about my, what you call, privilege. I've lived a life of responsibility in my own way. Just because it doesn't fit the narrative you want doesn't mean it isn't real." A ripple of gasps and murmurs rolled through the audience. Joy Behar leaned in slightly, perhaps sensing the need to diffuse the tension. All right, let's," she started, but Sonny held up a hand, still locked on Brad. "I'm not trying to lecture you, Brad," Sonny said, her voice a shade softer but no less firm. "I'm asking because a lot of people look to you for leadership. And when they don't hear you speak up, they wonder if you even see the problem." Brad's fingers tapped once on the table, a tiny, restless motion. The cameras caught it. His breathing had grown a fraction deeper, his composure fraying at the edges. "Maybe," he said finally. "The problem is we've started expecting actors to be moral compasses. I'm not here to lead anyone. I'm here to tell stories." The tension in the room had reached a fever pitch, that fragile silence that comes just before something breaks. Sunny's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, as if weighing her next words like a chess player calculating a decisive move. "You can say that, Brad," she said, her tone calm but carrying a quiet edge that cut through the air. "But you also know that with your platform, staying neutral is a choice. And in times like these, neutrality is." Brad's voice snapped louder than anyone expected, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Don't tell me what neutrality is." The room reacted in a collective gasp. A camera jolted slightly as if the operator had been startled. Even Whoopi's usually impassive face shifted, her eyes widening as she sat up straighter. Brad blinked as if realizing the force in his voice, but the words were already out there, raw and alive. He exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together, the muscles in his jaw working. The studio audience shifted, murmuring softly, sensing they were witnessing something rare, a crack in Brad Pitt's famously composed demeanor. Somewhere off stage, a producer gestured frantically for the cameras to stay tight on the faces at the table. Sunny, for her part, didn't flinch. Her voice came quieter now, almost like a whisper carried on steel. "This is the conversation people have been waiting for you to have." For a heartbeat, the two locked eyes, Brad's gaze blazing with restrained fury, Sunny's calm but unyielding. The world outside the studio seemed to vanish, reduced to that tense exchange of unspoken challenge. Then the stage manager signaled a commercial break. The bright applause sign flashed, but the audience stayed silent, as if applause would shatter the spell of what they had just witnessed. The cameras cut, but Brad stayed frozen in place, staring at the table as though wrestling with words he couldn't quite say. The red light on the camera went dark, and the commercial jingle played softly in the background. But the tension at the table didn't fade. It thickened, like a storm cloud refusing to drift away. The audience, usually quick to chatter and shuffle during breaks, remained unusually hushed. You could hear the faint buzz of the studio lights overhead, the soft rustle of cue cards in a producer's hand. Brad sat rigid in his chair, staring down at his clasped hands as though the polished wooden table beneath them held all the answers he couldn't find. Sunny Hostin leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes stayed on Brad, assessing. Joy Behar reached for her water bottle, breaking the silence with the tiny click of the cap. Whoopi glanced briefly at one of the producers, then back at Brad, her brow furrowed in that mix of concern and curiosity that only a seasoned host could wear. A floor manager leaned in quietly to the table. "We're back in 30, he murmured. "Keep it smooth, folks." Brad didn't move. His fingers drummed against the edge of the table once, then stilled. He finally lifted his gaze, first toward Sunny, then across to Whoopi, as if weighing what he might say, or what he might regret. "Look," he said under his breath, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those at the table. "If this is going to turn into some public trial, I don't know why I agreed to come on." Whoopi tilted her head, her voice low but steady. "Nobody's putting you on trial, Brad. But you know how this show goes. We talk about the real stuff." Brad exhaled sharply, shaking his head once. "Real stuff's fine, but there's a difference between a conversation and a cross-examination." Sunny didn't answer right away. She just watched him with that calm, analytical gaze. Then she said quietly, "You know it's not personal, but these are questions people ask." Brad's eyes flicked toward her. "Yeah," he said after a beat, his tone clipped. "But sometimes it feels like it's not really about the questions, just about the headline you get afterward." The floor manager raised his hand. 10 seconds. Brad straightened, his expression smoothing like a mask slipping back into place. The studio audience stirred as the camera's red lights blinked back on. The hosts smiled for the return from break, their voices lifting a little higher. But underneath it all the current of tension hummed on, invisible yet palpable. "Welcome back to The View," Whoopi said, her tone carrying that practiced blend of warmth and gravitas. "We're here with Brad Pitt, talking about his new film, and, well, a little bit more than that." A polite ripple of applause rose and fell from the audience. Brad offered a small smile. "Happy to be here," he said, his voice even but lacking the usual ease. Sunny leaned forward again, her elbows resting lightly on the table. "Brad, before the break, we were talking about the responsibility that comes with having a platform. I want to ask, do you think that responsibility has changed over time? Has fame changed what people expect from you?" Brad's smile faltered again. He shifted slightly in his seat, then gave a soft laugh that sounded more like a sigh. "You know, I think fame hasn't changed as much as people think. What's changed is the noise around it. Everyone's got a phone, a platform, an opinion. You can't breathe without someone saying you should have breathed differently. A few in the audience chuckled softly, but Sunny didn't. She kept her eyes on him. But isn't that part of the job now? To deal with the noise. To use your voice in it. Brad's gaze met hers head-on. I'm an actor, Sunny. I tell stories. I'm not a politician, not a preacher. I do what I can in the ways I can. If that's not loud enough for some people. He spread his hands slightly, as if to say, what more do you want? Sunny tilted her head. But sometimes silence can feel like a story, too. The audience let out a soft collective, oh, like witnesses to a sharp but polite jab. The air thickened again. Joy Behar jumped in, her tone lighter, as if hoping to diffuse the rising tension. I mean, come on, Brad's got, like 50 movies under his belt? Maybe he just wants a day off from saving the world. A few laughs rippled through the audience, but Brad didn't join in. His lips pressed together as he glanced briefly at Joy, then back at Sunny. It's not about saving the world. It's about how much people think they're owed access to your thoughts. Sunny didn't blink. People don't want access to your thoughts. They want to know if you're standing with them or not. For a heartbeat, Brad said nothing. His fingers tapped the table again. 1, 2, 3, before he finally spoke. You know what's funny? I came here to talk about the art, the work. But it's like none of that matters anymore. All that matters is where you stand. The edge in his voice was sharper now, audible even to the furthest rows of the audience. A few people shifted in their seats, sensing the rising heat. Sunny's tone stayed measured. Art reflects the world we live in. People want to know if the artist sees what they see. Brad leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tighter together. And what if the artist just wants to make something true, without picking a side? Sunny's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Then maybe that artist has the luxury to stay out of the fight. The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. The room's energy shifted. Even Joy's expression sobered. Brad's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening. I didn't come here to be called a coward, he said, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable heat. I didn't call you a coward, Sunny replied gently, though her gaze didn't soften. I said you have the luxury. That's not the same thing. The audience held its breath. You could almost hear the faint whir of the cameras capturing every flicker of Brad's expression. For a long moment, Brad stared at Sunny. Then he leaned back in his chair, his lips pressing into a thin line. Feels the same from where I'm sitting, he muttered. Whoopi stepped in, her voice steady but with a subtle warning note beneath it. All right, let's remember, we're having a conversation here, not a standoff. Brad gave a short, humorless laugh. Sometimes they feel the same. The tension didn't break. If anything, it deepened, pressing down on the room like heavy air before a summer storm. Sunny spoke again, her voice softer now but carrying the same unyielding resolve. Brad, I think people just wanted to hear you say that you see them. That's all. Brad's eyes shifted away, toward the edge of the stage, as if searching for something. An escape, a word, a breath. When he looked back at Sunny, his voice was quieter, but there was still a hard edge beneath it. I see people, he said. I just don't think they always see me for who I really am. There was something raw in his tone then, something almost vulnerable, but it didn't soften the crackling tension. If anything, it made the moment heavier, more human. The show cut to another short commercial break. The applause sign lit up again, but the audience's claps were scattered and subdued. The stage manager shot a wary glance toward the table. Brad rubbed the back of his neck, looking out toward the floor as if debating whether to stay in his seat. Sunny leaned back, her gaze still calm, but her fingers laced together tightly in front of her. Whoopi muttered something to a producer off to the side, her tone too low to catch. Joy sipped her water, avoiding eye contact with anyone. When the cameras came back, Brad's smile had returned, but it looked more like armor than warmth. The conversation picked back up, but the words carried the faint tremor of unspoken conflict, like a fault line beneath calm earth. Nobody in that studio knew it yet, but the breaking point was only minutes away. The third segment began with the bright theme music that usually set a lively tone. But beneath the cheerful notes, the air in the studio felt charged like static before a storm. The audience clapped dutifully as the cameras swept across the set, but their faces were tense. They had sensed what was coming, the way you can sense thunder before the clouds gather. The red light blinked on, and the view was live again. "Welcome back," Whoopi said, her voice steady but carrying a subtle weight, as if she too could feel the pressure building. "We're still here with Brad Pitt, talking about his new film, his work, and, well, a few other things that have come up." Brad smiled at the camera, but it was a smile too neat, too fixed. You could almost see the effort behind it, like a man standing in the eye of a storm, trying to convince the world the winds were calm. Sunny Hostin leaned in, her tone carefully even. "Brad, I want to get back to something you said earlier, that you just want to tell stories, not pick sides. I understand that. But don't you think that sometimes the stories we tell, or choose not to tell, say more than words ever could?" Brad's fingers tapped once against the table. The sound was faint but picked up by the microphones. His smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Something wary, something defensive. "I think stories are meant to open doors," he said, his tone calm but clipped. "They're not meant to tell you which door to walk through." Sunny nodded slightly, acknowledging the point, but pressed on. "But isn't staying neutral in a story about injustice, about real harm, essentially choosing the side of silence?" The studio audience shifted again, a soft rustle of bodies leaning forward. The tension was no longer just felt. It was audible, a hum beneath the quiet. Brad inhaled slowly, then exhaled, his gaze fixed on Sunny. "You know," he said, his voice low but carrying a sharp edge, "I've spent my whole career trying to focus on the work. I'm not a pundit. I'm not here to give speeches. But it seems like no matter what I do, somebody wants to tell me I'm doing it wrong." Sunny's reply was measured but unwavering. "I don't think anyone's saying you're doing it wrong. I think they're asking you to recognize the power you have. A voice like yours can change the way millions of people think about something." Brad gave a short laugh, but it wasn't lighthearted. It was the laugh of a man cornered. "That's a nice idea. But the truth is, the second you say something, even if it's meant to help, you become a headline. And then the conversation stops being about the issue and starts being about you." There was a ripple of murmurs in the audience. A few people nodded, others whispered to each other. The camera caught Joy Behar shifting uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Brad and Sunny. Sunny's tone softened, but her words didn't. "But maybe that's the price of influence, Brad. Maybe it's not supposed to be comfortable." Brad's mask slipped just a fraction. His shoulders tensed, his eyes flashed. "You know what's uncomfortable? Being judged for not speaking enough, and then judged even more when you do. I've seen that movie. I know how it ends." A nervous laugh fluttered through the audience but died quickly. The tension was no longer beneath the surface. It was at the table, visible, palpable. Whoopi shifted in her seat. "Okay," she said with a faint smile meant to lighten the mood. "Let's all remember why we're here." But Sunny spoke over her, not harshly but firmly. "I think a lot of people just want to know, Brad, when they see injustice, are you standing with them or not? That's not a trap. That's a question." Brad's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice dropping lower. "And I'm saying it's not that simple. Life's not that simple. You don't get to know everything I do behind the scenes. That doesn't mean I'm not standing with the right people." Sunny held his gaze. "But you won't say it." That was the spark. Brad's jaw clenched visibly. He straightened in his seat, his hands flattening on the table. His voice, when it came, was no longer quiet. It had the raw, unguarded force of a man who'd been pushed too far. "Because I'm tired of being told I'm not enough," he snapped. The studio went dead silent. The audience froze, caught off guard by the sudden thunder in his voice. Even the hosts looked momentarily stunned. Brad pressed on, the dam of restraint breaking. "I've been doing this for decades. I've given my time, my money, my name to causes I believe in. And yet every time I sit here, it's never enough. It's always, say more, do more, prove more. I'm done proving myself to strangers." Sunny's lips parted slightly, but for once, no words came immediately. Her expression shifted. Less confrontational now, more searching. Brad shook his head, his voice still sharp but quieter. "I came here to talk about a film that's about hope. About resilience. Not to sit here and defend myself for not saying the exact words you want to hear." The audience murmured again, louder this time. Some looked sympathetic, others uneasy. Sunny finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I hear you. I do. But I think people wanted to hear that hope from you, too." Brad let out a bitter, short laugh. Maybe they should stop looking for hope in actors. The words landed like a slap, raw, unvarnished, cutting. There was no laugh this time, no murmur. just the heavy silence of a room that had just witnessed something irreversible. Whoopi's voice broke the silence, low and measured. "Brad, take a breath." But Brad had already leaned back, his face hardening as if a decision had crystallized in his mind. His eyes flicked to the audience, then to the cameras, then back to Sunny. "I think I've said enough," he said, his voice flat now, stripped of both charm and anger, just finality. Before anyone could respond, he pushed back his chair. The scrape of it against the floor rang louder than the applause sign blinking above the audience. A producer offstage gestured frantically, mouthing "stay," but Brad ignored it. He stood, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and without another word, turned and began to walk toward the wings of the stage. The studio erupted into gasps, a few shouts, the sound of dozens of phones being raised to capture the moment. "Brad!" Joy called after him, half rising from her seat, but he didn't look back. Sunny sat still, her face calm but her eyes following him as he strode off. Whoopi sighed quietly, glancing at the camera, then at the stunned audience. The sound of Brad's footsteps faded as he disappeared behind the curtains, leaving an empty chair at the table. A stark, silent testament to the clash that had just unfolded live before millions. The camera panned briefly to the audience, capturing their wide-eyed expressions, then back to the hosts. For a long heartbeat, nobody spoke. Then Joy let out a low, almost incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "Well, I guess we'll go to break." The applause sign flashed, but the claps that followed were hesitant, uneven, like thunder after a lightning strike. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled, phones buzzed, and whispers raced through the crew. Clips of Brad's walk-off were already being uploaded by audience members, captions flashing across social media. "Brad Pitt storms off The View." The headlines had been born before the commercial break even began. The moment Brad Pitt's figure vanished behind the heavy studio curtains, the silence he left behind was almost physical. It hung in the air like a thick fog that refused to lift. In the control room, producers scrambled, their voices sharp over the headsets. "Camera 3, wide shot. Keep it steady. Don't follow him backstage. Stay on the table." On set, Joy Behar sat with her mouth slightly open, one hand still half raised from where she'd called after him. Sunny Hostin lowered her gaze to her notes, then looked up again, her face composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, or the weight of the moment. Whoopi Goldberg cleared her throat softly and addressed the audience. Her voice, usually laid back and calm, carried a new kind of gravity. "Well, live television. You never know what's going to happen." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd, but most of the audience remained quiet, glancing at one another as if unsure whether to clap or wait. The applause sign blinked red above them, but the clapping that followed was muted, hesitant, an awkward punctuation to a conversation that had veered into something far more intense than anyone had anticipated. The show cut to commercial. The moment the red camera lights dimmed, the studio erupted in hushed chatter. Crew members rushed toward the stage. A producer leaned down to speak urgently to Sunny, who nodded, her expression thoughtful but calm. Backstage, Brad Pitt stood near the exit, his back to the wall, breathing in slow, deliberate breaths. A publicist whispered something to him, but he just shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. The doors to the stage corridor opened and closed as crew passed in and out, but Brad remained still, a solitary figure in the whirlwind of behind-the-scenes activity. His departure wasn't angry in the theatrical sense. It was quieter, more resolute, like a man who had decided he'd said everything he was willing to say. By the time the show returned from commercial, Brad was gone. Whoopi addressed the viewers at home, her tone measured and professional, though there was a faint edge of empathy in her voice. "As you've just seen, Brad has left us for the day. We're going to continue our conversation, and we hope everyone remembers that these discussions, no matter how difficult, are part of what makes us all think a little deeper." Joy tried to inject a note of levity, forcing a thin smile. "Well, I guess we'll have to invite him back, if he'll come." The audience responded with a ripple of awkward laughter, but the mood in the studio was changed. Sunny sat quietly for a few moments, her fingers laced together in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but clear. "I hope he knows the questions weren't meant as an attack. Sometimes the hardest questions are the ones we most need to ask." That remark lingered in the air, unanswered. As the show wrapped up the segment, the producers tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics, but the gravity of the walk-off refused to lift. The camera zoomed out for the closing shot of the table, one seat empty, like an unspoken reminder of the moment that had just unfolded live before millions. In the hours that followed, the internet caught fire. Clips of Brad standing, his chair scraping against the studio floor, played on loop across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Headlines screamed across entertainment websites. Brad Pitt storms off the View after clash with Sonny Hostin. Walk-off shock. Brad loses his cool live on TV. The moment that shook daytime television. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Brad Pitt walks off. Hashtag the View clash. Hashtag Sonny versus Brad. Some posts praised Brad for defending himself, calling him brave for refusing to perform for public approval. Others criticized him for walking away from a necessary conversation. Memes appeared within hours. Images of Brad's stern expression paired with captions like, "When you're done explaining yourself to the world." On talk radio, entertainment podcasts, and late-night shows, the moment became the subject of heated debate. Was Brad right to leave? Did Sonny push too hard? Or was it just the inevitable clash of two powerful voices meeting in the same space? By the next morning, clips of the walk-off had racked up millions of views. On fan forums and comment sections, emotions ran high. Some wrote long posts defending Brad, recounting his history of charity work and his often private advocacy efforts. Others argued that his silence during key cultural moments had been frustrating for years, and Sonny had merely said what many had thought. Back at the View, the empty chair from the day before still felt symbolic. The hosts addressed the incident briefly on the following episode, keeping their words professional, but the undercurrent of tension was still there, like a faint echo of the storm. The story of that day wasn't just about a celebrity losing his temper on live TV. It was about the fragile line between personal boundaries and public expectations, the collision between private conviction and the relentless demand for public stance. It was about how even the most composed figures can crack under the weight of being constantly asked to define themselves, not as artists, but as symbols. And now, as the screen fades from that charged studio to you, the viewer, one question lingers in the air. What do you think? Was Brad Pitt right to walk away? Or did Sonny Hostin press a question that needed to be asked? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop your opinion in the comments below. And if you want more dramatic, raw stories of unforgettable live television moments, subscribe now to Prime Narrator. Hit that like button to keep these stories alive, and share this video with your friends, because sometimes the most shocking drama isn't scripted. The camera pulls back one last time, the echoes of that studio clash still lingering in the air, as the narrator's voice drops to a final, compelling whisper. Moments like this remind us that no matter how famous, no one is immune to the power of a single pointed question.